Millionaire finds homeless woman with twins, then recognizes her as his first love. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. On the cold, unforgiving pavement of the city street, Sarah Adams huddled against a crumbling brick wall, her thin coat doing little to shield her from the biting chill of the night air. The harsh wind pierced through the worn fabric, but she barely noticed it as she tightened her arms around her twin daughters. Ella and Grace. Both were asleep, their tiny bodies curled together beneath a thin, tattered blanket that barely seemed enough to cover them. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of how little she could offer them. Her own body, battered and exhausted from years of struggling to survive, trembled with hunger, but her mind was resolute. She would protect her daughters at any cost. She had learned long ago how to survive, how to make the most of the scraps life gave her, but tonight, the weight of it all felt heavier than ever. The city, oblivious to her suffering, passed by in a blur of hurried footsteps, honking horns, and the distant wail of sirens. Yet, for all the noise and movement around her, Sarah felt invisible, just another face in the crowd, discarded and forgotten by the world. She forced a smile as Ella stirred in her sleep, her small hand clutching Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy, why is it always so cold?" she murmured, her voice fragile with the innocence of a child who shouldn't have to understand the harshness of the world. Sarah brushed her daughter's tangled hair from her forehead, trying to keep her voice warm despite the ache in her chest. "Because winter is here, sweetheart," she whispered, her own words a comfort she could not fully believe. "But you know what cold nights mean? We get to snuggle closer. And that's the best part." Grace shifted in her arms, her small body curling even tighter against Sarah. "I don't like the cold," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I want to go home." The word, home, struck Sarah like a physical blow, a reminder of everything she had lost. Home was no longer a place, it was a dream, a distant memory of warmth and safety. "We have each other, baby," Sarah replied, her voice steady even though her heart trembled. "That's what makes anywhere we go a home." As Ella and Grace drifted back to sleep, Sarah's thoughts wandered to a time when her life was different, when she was not just surviving, but dreaming of a future filled with hope. But those dreams had long since faded, crushed by the relentless weight of living on the streets. Yet, for her daughters, she still held onto that glimmer of hope, a hope she could not allow herself to let go of. As the night deepened, Sarah's stomach growled with the emptiness that had become her constant companion. The last of their food had been a half-eaten sandwich given to her by a stranger earlier. But she had saved it for the girls. She had nothing left for herself but the quiet strength of a mother determined to protect her children from a world that had already turned its back on them. The bitter cold of the night pressed in, the wind sweeping through the alleyway with a relentless, icy bite. Yet, amidst the harsh winter chill, Sarah sat still, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughters, her body a fragile shield against the world. Ella stirred, her soft, sleepy voice cutting through the silence. "Mommy, why do people walk past us like they don't see us?" Her question, simple and innocent, seemed to hang in the air like an unspoken truth. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to keep her voice calm. "They're busy, sweetie," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from Ella's face, her hands trembling slightly. "Sometimes people don't stop because they're rushing to work, or they're thinking about their families. But we're people too, right?" Grace, still half asleep, curled tighter into Sarah's side, her small body seeking warmth and comfort. "I want to go home, Mommy," she mumbled, her voice heavy with the weight of all the things a child should never have to understand. Sarah's heart cracked, but she forced a smile. "We're together, love," she whispered, though she felt the sting of her own words. "That's what makes anywhere we go a home." The hollow ache of it all settled deep in her chest. They had no home, no place that could offer them the safety and warmth every child deserved. But she would keep fighting. For them, she would never stop. As Ella and Grace drifted back into sleep, Sarah's thoughts wandered, the loneliness of the streets crashing over her like the unforgiving wind. It wasn't the cold that made her shiver, it was the unrelenting weight of survival. The world had turned its back on them, yet she still had the strength to keep moving forward, to protect her girls with everything she had. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of just how much she had given up for them. The last of their food, a stale sandwich from a kind stranger, had been split between the twins, leaving Sarah with nothing but the empty, hollow ache of hunger gnawing at her insides. The city moved on, oblivious to their suffering, people brushing past them, too busy to care. Sarah had learned long ago that people didn't look, they didn't want to see the faces of those living in the shadows. The forgotten ones who fought for every scrap of survival. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long shadows, but they couldn't hide the loneliness in Sarah's heart. The night was their only companion, cold and indifferent, and yet, despite the world's neglect, she still held onto the faintest glimmer of hope for her daughters. For a future she couldn't yet see but would fight for with everything inside her. The night stretched on, thick and heavy, as Sarah held her daughters close, the sound of their breathing the only comfort in the cold darkness. The city around them thrummed with life, but it felt like a world they no longer belonged to. Grace shifted in her sleep, her small body curling against Sarah's warmth, while Ella clung tighter, sensing the quiet unease in her mother's embrace. The weight of their situation, their isolation, the constant struggle, pressed down on Sarah. But she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when her girls needed her more than ever. The wind howled through the alley, tearing at the thin fabric of their blanket, the edges frayed and worn. Sarah's fingers, numb from the cold, instinctively reached for the silver ring on her finger. A quiet reminder of a past life, one filled with promises and dreams that now felt like distant echoes. The ring, once a symbol of love and hope, now felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. But Sarah couldn't allow herself to dwell on that, not when Ella and Grace were asleep, unaware of the harsh reality surrounding them. "Mommy, will we ever have a house again?" Grace's innocent voice broke through the silence. A question that hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. How could she answer that? How could she tell her daughter that the dream of a home, of warmth and security, seemed so far out of reach? She forced herself to smile, brushing a tear from her cheek before it could fall. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with a mix of pain and hope. "One day, we'll have a house, with big windows and warm beds." Her words hung in the air, fragile promises of a better future, even though she had no idea how to make them come true. But Grace's smile, so full of innocent trust, kept her going. Sarah's heart ached as she held them tighter, knowing they deserved so much more than the cold pavement beneath them. Suddenly, a loud car horn broke through the quiet of the night. Sarah tensed, instinctively pulling Ella and Grace closer. The sound of an engine idling, the low hum of a luxury car coming to a stop just a few feet away, sent a chill through her. She didn't know why, but something about the car made her uneasy. She glanced up, and for a split second, their eyes met. A brief connection between a man behind the wheel and the woman huddled on the street with her children. He stared at her, something in his gaze unsettled, as though he recognized her, though Sarah couldn't place him. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, the light changed, and the car sped off, disappearing into the night. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, that somehow, this night, this moment, would mark the beginning of something she couldn't yet understand. The cold night air clung to Sarah like an unwelcome visitor, slipping through the seams of her worn-out coat and biting into her skin. She was used to it by now, the ache in her bones, the gnawing hunger that never seemed to go away, but nothing could numb the sharp pang of despair that settled deep in her chest as she watched Grace and Ella sleep. Their tiny bodies curled up together, nestled under the frayed edges of the thin blanket, looking so fragile, so innocent. They had no idea how hard their mother fought every day just to keep them safe, just to keep them alive. Her stomach growled, a cruel reminder of the empty pit inside her. But Sarah ignored it. She had given them the last of the food, a half-eaten sandwich she had found abandoned on the ground earlier. A meager offering from a stranger too busy to stop. It wasn't enough to fill her, but it was enough to keep them going. The world moved around them, indifferent to their plight. People walked by, eyes straight ahead, pretending not to see the three of them huddled in the cold. The harsh reality was that to most people, they were invisible. A faint cough from Ella stirred Sarah from her thoughts. The little girl shifted in her sleep, her small fingers instinctively curling tighter around her mother's coat, as if to claim her. Sarah pressed a kiss to her forehead, trying to keep her heart from breaking. She glanced at Grace, who shifted in her sleep and mumbled something about wanting to go home. Home. The word cut through Sarah like a knife. Once, it had meant warmth, comfort, a sense of belonging. Now, it was just a dream. One that seemed so far out of reach that it almost felt foolish to even think about it. But she couldn't help it. Her girls deserved a home. A place where they didn't have to feel the cold gnawing at their skin. Where they could sleep without fear. Without the constant ache of hunger and uncertainty. "Do you think we'll ever have a real home again?" Grace asked, her voice small, full of hope that still clung to her despite the harsh world around her. Sarah took a deep breath, pushing down the fear that tried to rise in her throat. She smiled softly, brushing the wind-tangled hair from Grace's face. "Yes, sweetheart, one day we will," she said, her voice thick with emotion she didn't dare show. "A big house with a warm bed. And we'll be safe, I promise." But even as the words left her mouth, a part of her wondered if that was nothing more than a fantasy. A lie she told herself to keep going. She had no way of knowing when or how it would happen. But she had to believe it. For them. Because without that belief, without that flicker of hope, what was left? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The sharp click of heels against the pavement, growing louder as they approached. A woman, dressed in an expensive coat, walked past, her eyes flicking over Sarah and the girls as she walked by. Sarah's heart sank as the woman looked away, her gaze avoiding them as if they were nothing more than a stain on the sidewalk. It wasn't the first time she had felt the sting of judgment. The sting of being invisible in a world that couldn't be bothered to look. But just as the woman was about to pass by, she stopped, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman's eyes flickered back to Sarah, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than before. Something in her expression shifted, curiosity. Or perhaps guilt, and then the woman reached into her purse. Pulling out a few crumpled bills, she dropped them into Sarah's cup without a word, her face expressionless, as if the act of giving was something she had been trained to do. Not something she felt compelled to do. Sarah stared at the money, her fingers trembling as she closed her hand around it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy them a warm drink. Maybe a small meal. For a moment, she wondered what the woman saw when she looked at her. Was it pity? Disgust? Or had it been something more? Something that Sarah didn't dare hope for? But before Sarah could even look up to thank the woman, she was gone, lost in the crowd, moving on with her life while Sarah and her daughters were left in the shadows. The world continued on, oblivious to their struggles, their pain, but Sarah didn't let herself feel bitter. She couldn't afford to. She had her girls, and that was all that mattered. As long as they had each other, they could survive. They would survive. Grace and Ella needed her to be strong, even when everything else around them seemed to be falling apart. She pulled them closer, their small bodies warm against her, and whispered into the quiet night, "We'll make it through this. I promise." And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe it. The cold night wrapped around Sarah like a suffocating blanket, its bite sharp and unforgiving, seeping through her thin coat and settling deep into her bones. But it wasn't the chill that made her shiver, it was the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The hollow ache that had become all too familiar. She sat on the cracked pavement, her back pressed against the hard wall of an alleyway, trying to shield Grace and Ella from the biting winds. The girls slept, curled up together beneath the meager blanket they had managed to salvage from a shelter. Their tiny faces peaceful in sleep, unaware of the cruel world around them. Sarah watched them, her heart swelling with both love and despair. They deserved so much more than this. They deserved warmth, a bed, a life that wasn't constantly dictated by survival. A distant memory, once filled with dreams of a better life, now felt like a cruel joke. The future had become a blur of hunger, cold, and endless days on the streets. Once, Sarah had believed that she could give her girls a bright future. She had imagined a home, laughter, safety, but now, all she could offer was her arms, her promises, and a love that never wavered, no matter how broken she felt. She looked down at Ella, who stirred in her sleep, her small hands reaching for Sarah's coat, as if sensing the cold creeping in. "Mommy?" Ella murmured, her voice soft, barely audible against the city noise. "Why is it always so cold?" Sarah forced a smile, brushing a strand of blonde hair from Ella's face, her voice tender despite the ache in her chest. "Because it's winter, sweetheart," she whispered, holding her tighter. "But you know what? Cold nights mean we get to snuggle closer." And that's the best part. Right? Grace, still half asleep, snuggled closer to Sarah, her small hands clutching at her waist. I don't like the cold, she muttered, her voice drowsy but laced with a sadness that cut through Sarah's heart. I want to go home. The word home echoed in Sarah's mind like a haunting melody. A place she could never give them. She closed her eyes, swallowing the lump in her throat. Home, a distant dream, a word that had once carried warmth, but now felt like a fantasy. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile for her girls. We are home, sweetie, Sarah said, her voice shaking but steady. As long as we have each other. Anywhere we go is home. But Grace's innocent question cut through her resolve. Do you think we'll ever have a house again? Like the ones with big windows and warm beds? Sarah hesitated, a lump forming in her throat. She wanted to promise them the world. But she knew she couldn't. Not in this moment. Not when her heart ached with the truth that she didn't know how she would ever make that dream come true. Yes, my love, one day we will, she whispered, pressing a kiss to Grace's forehead. I don't know how, but we will. We'll have a house with big windows. And warm beds. And everything will be okay. The words hung in the air. Fragile and uncertain. Sarah didn't know how they would ever escape the nightmare they were living. But she had to hold on to that hope for them. For Grace and Ella. They deserved more than this life on the streets. They deserved a chance. As Grace and Ella drifted back into a peaceful sleep, Sarah sat there, her body exhausted and her mind racing. Hunger gnawed at her insides. But she ignored it. The girls needed her to be strong. To shield them from the world that often turned a blind eye to their suffering. She had nothing to offer them but her love. But for now, it had to be enough. She glanced down at the cup in her hands. The worn edges crinkling from the weight of the coins inside. It wasn't much, but maybe enough for a small meal. Maybe she could get them something warm to eat. Her eyes flickered to the people walking by. Their faces lost in the rush of the city. Indifferent to the three of them huddled in the cold. She had learned long ago that most people didn't stop. Didn't care. They kept their heads down. Pretending not to see the invisible people. The ones who lived in the shadows of the city. Forgotten and discarded. Sarah's throat tightened, but she didn't let the bitterness take hold. She couldn't afford to let it. Not now. Not for Grace and Ella. She had given up on expecting kindness from the world. But every now and then, someone would surprise her. A passerby. A stranger with a kind heart. Someone who saw them, who cared, if only for a moment. As Sarah shifted in her seat, adjusting the blanket over the girls, a car pulled up to the stoplight just a few feet away. Sarah's gaze flickered to it, and for a moment, she thought it was just another car. Another driver lost in the world of their own problems. But then something caught her eye, the faint gleam of a silver ring. Resting on her finger, a ring that once symbolized love, hope, and a future. The memory of a life long gone. Her pulse quickened, and for a brief moment, she froze. The cold night air seemed to still around her as her gaze locked onto the ring. It was a sharp reminder of what she had lost, what she could never get back. A love that had once been, now replaced by the harsh reality of the streets, of survival. But Sarah couldn't afford to dwell on the past. Not now, not when her girls needed her. When every breath she took was for them. She quickly tucked the ring back beneath her coat. Her thoughts scattered. She couldn't afford to get lost in the past. She had to focus on the here and now. For Grace and Ella, her eyes scanned the streets. The faces moving by without stopping. Without even a glance. She sighed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. But as she looked at the girls, their peaceful faces, Sarah felt a small spark of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe things could get better. Maybe there was a way out. She just had to keep believing it. For them, for their future. With a deep breath, she tightened her grip on her daughters, wrapping them as close to her as possible, and whispered softly into the cold night. We'll make it through this. We will, I promise. The cold had settled in deeper. A biting reminder of the life Sarah had been forced to endure. Her fingers trembled, not from the chill in the air, but from the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Every passing car, every hurried face, felt like a world she was no longer a part of. Yet, in this moment, she had to push forward. Had to keep going for Grace and Ella. Their soft breaths were the only warmth in the freezing night. And the only thing that kept her anchored to this broken reality. She watched the few coins in the bottom of her cup. A silent plea for help. But no one stopped. The city's indifference was deafening. Each passerby lost in their own world, unable, or unwilling, to see the suffering right in front of them. Sarah's heart ached as Ella stirred, her little hands reaching for her mother. The innocence in her eyes made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she could hardly describe. Grace, still half asleep, murmured something about wanting to go home. And for the first time, Sarah felt the weight of the word like a heavy stone. Home, a place she once dreamed of. A place that now seemed as far away as the stars. But despite everything, despite the hunger, the exhaustion, the judgment, Sarah's resolve never wavered. She wasn't about to give up on them. She couldn't. As Grace whispered again about wanting a home, Sarah smiled softly, brushing the hair from her face. We have each other, sweetheart. That's all we need, she whispered back, even though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this fight going. The world around them didn't stop. But she wouldn't either, not as long as Grace and Ella had faith in her. Not as long as they believed in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the sleek black car slowed to a stop. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing, casting a long shadow in the dim light. Her instincts screamed to pull Grace and Ella closer, to shield them from whoever this was. She didn't trust easily anymore, not after everything life had thrown her way. But something about him made her pause, a feeling that gnawed at her. A hint of recognition that she couldn't shake. Her eyes flicked to the ring on her hand, the silver band glinting in the streetlight. And the memory hit her like a wave. The man's voice was a whisper at first. But when he said her name, Sarah, it was as though time had collapsed around them. The world went still, her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. The man standing before her was someone from a past she had buried long ago. He had once been everything, her future, her hope, and yet here he was. His expression filled with disbelief and something darker she couldn't name. He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. And for a moment, all Sarah could do was stare. This isn't real, she thought, but it was. The man she thought she'd lost forever had somehow found her again. And just like that, the walls she'd spent years building around herself began to crumble. Sarah's mind raced as she stepped back, instinctively clutching her daughters tighter. The man's voice, filled with pain and disbelief, echoed in her ears. Ethan, that name, her heart squeezed. The years of loneliness, of survival, of fighting for her daughters, it all crashed down on her in that moment. She'd never imagined seeing him again, especially not like this. His presence stirred something deep within her, a memory of the girl she had been, the girl who had once believed in love, in promises. But that was a lifetime ago. She wasn't that girl anymore. The world had hardened her. And all that mattered now was her children. She couldn't afford to look back. She couldn't let him tear down the fragile walls she'd built around them. And yet, as she saw the pain in his eyes, the raw regret, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her voice, steady but cold, broke the silence. I don't need your help, Ethan. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wasn't true. She was scared, scared of letting him in, scared of what it might mean for the life she had worked so hard to build. Ethan stood there, silent, his gaze unwavering. He was offering her something she didn't think she could accept. And yet, for the first time in years, a part of her wanted to. The moment Sarah stepped into Ethan's luxurious mansion, the weight of her decision hit her. She felt like a stranger in a world so far removed from the streets she had fought to survive on. Her daughters were safe, their small, peaceful breaths a relief, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Every step she took, every glance at the opulence around her, reminded her of the life she'd lost, the girl she used to be. Ethan's presence was a constant reminder of everything she had been forced to leave behind. She didn't know if she could ever fit into this world, no matter how much he wanted to help. As she tucked her daughters into bed, the warmth of the room felt like an unfamiliar luxury, one she wasn't sure she deserved. But as she kissed their foreheads, she knew one thing: she would do anything to protect them, even if it meant facing the ghosts of her past. As the days passed in Ethan's mansion, Sarah's unease never fully faded. Though her daughters reveled in the warmth and safety, she remained on edge, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. The life she had known, the life of survival, felt ingrained in her every step. But then, one evening, as she sat on the balcony, her fingers tracing the rim of a cup, Ethan joined her. His presence, once a distant memory, now felt like an anchor. He didn't rush her, didn't try to fix everything at once. Instead, he simply sat with her, offering his quiet support. Sarah felt a small crack form in the walls she had built around herself. Maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to rebuild, this time. Not on her own, but with someone who truly cared. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they could have a future.